Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about some dangers that can come up in the beginning of a chess game after only these two moves are played. These moves, pawn to e4, pawn to e5, represents a king's pawn opening. And this is fairly common. No matter what level strength player you are, you will probably have seen this at some point. Now, the position I want to look at is after white develops their knight here to f3. Now this move does two things, well, three things. First of all, it attacks the pawn, and black has to respond to this threat immediately. Another thing that it does is it controls this center square, preparing moves like d5, or d4, excuse me. And the last thing I'll say that this move does is it clears space for white to castle his king. Okay, so now I want to talk about the correct responses first, and then I'll show some pitfalls that black can fall into. Now, the most common move for black is to simply bring their knight here to c6, which defends the center pawn. Also controls this square, so it makes it harder for whites to play their pawn to d4. And this usually leads to an Italian game with moves like bishop c4, the Gioco Piano, or bishop to b5, known as the Roy Lopez, probably one of the most popular chess openings of all time. And white could play knight to c3 with the four knights opening, and this is a bit dull, but it is even for both sides. Good opening for beginners. So knight here is a very solid move, a very good move. Another choice that black has is to play pawn here to d6, connecting the center and strengthening it. One problem with this move is black needs to think about the future of their pieces, and this blocks in the bishop. This dark squared bishop now does not see the rest of the board. It is blocked by the pawn. And if black ever moves their pawn out of the way, this pawn here on e5 will be undefended again. So let's say this move, and here, these are just examples. And now this pawn is hanging again. So in this particular case, the pawn is kind of chained, it's married to the defense of the center pawn. This is known as the Philidor defense. It's acceptable, it's fair, it's okay, but it's definitely not black's best option. The best option, knight c6, as we talked about. And basically all these moves have one common purpose, which is to defend the e5 pawn. Some other choices you might see. You might have bishop here. They bring their bishop out, and they defend the pawn. However, this violates one of the first, I'll say, most basic rules when you play a chess game, is to not block your center pawns. So now, because of this bishop move, the queen's pawn here cannot come up the board, which weakens black's control of the center for the foreseeable future. For example, play could continue knight here, bishop here, knight here, castle, castle, here. And now black has to move, but there's not a lot of good choices for black. Black would love to go pawn here and bring their light square bishop to somewhere, but these moves aren't possible because this center pawn is blocked. So these example moves aren't super important, but the point is that you don't want to block your center pawn, and that's exactly what black has done here. This is not a good response, and it actually gives white a noticeable advantage right away if they know what they're doing. Okay, you might see a queen move. The queen can defend the pawn here on e7 or here on f6. But that breaks another rule of chess, which says don't bring out your queen too early. Now, the queen is a big target for white. Well, for the white minor pieces in particular. And these knights and bishops love to attack the queen because that makes the queen move. And then black loses time. So what this might look like is, well, this pawn's defended, so white just brings out his piece. Black brings out his piece. And all of a sudden, we're attacking the queen. Now the queen has to move. So where do you go to? Oh, by the way, there's a fork over here. So all of a sudden, black's position is in a bit of trouble. He's all binded up. Maybe the queen goes back, and he moved his queen twice and did nothing. And white can just continue playing normal moves. And white has a lead in development and way more control over the center squares as well. So you don't want to defend early pawns with your queen. You never want to do that. You could even say this is just losing for black. Because if you go here, you block your bishop again. And it's still vulnerable to knight hops, like this. Or bishop moves such as these ones. These are just examples. So we learned that knight here is a reasonable choice. That's probably the best move. One other thing black can do is to develop their knight here, counter-attacking white's pawn in the center, with the idea that, okay, you attack me, but I attack you too. So, you know, it's symmetrical. He has copied the position, and it should be even, right? Yes, and this is known as the Petrov defense or the Russian defense. But black has to know what they're doing. So here, this is one of two main traps that I want to show you that can happen here. So white says, okay, that's a free pawn, I'll take it. Black says, well, you took mine, but I'll take yours too. He takes it. Now, what has happened here? There have only been 4 moves played. Really, just 2 moves each side. But there's already some very interesting differences in this position. There are no pawns on the e-file. The e-file is now an open file, which means there's no pawns blocking it. So long-range pieces such as the rooks and queen love to go on open files. So this move here, I know we say don't bring out your queen too early, but this attacks the knight immediately. So black has to move their knight or defend their knight. Let's look at what happens if they move their knight. So let's say they go here, back to where they were, and say no problem, mission accomplished. I took a pawn and I went home. But now, because of this open file, black's king is a sitting duck in the center. So all that white has to do is move this knight away. Notice how it is in the way of the queen's vision of the black king. Once the knight moves away, it's check. For example, the knight could go here, and then take the rook, because black has to deal with this check. Let's say we go here, check, defends the check, and then we take a rook. Yeah, that's very good for white, and white's winning here. But the trap I want to show specifically is knight here to c6, where black's knight should be. And this is check. Now there are, I think, 3 ways out of this check. You can block with the bishop, you can block with the queen, or you can throw your knight in the middle to stop that. First of all, if you put your knight in the middle, white simply takes the knight, and black is faced with the same problem. So that's not a good idea. What if you block with the queen? Well, we put our knight here for a reason. We'll take the queen. That's a queen up. Thank you very much. The last choice black has is block with the bishop. but our knight is still attacking the queen. That's the power of this knight discovery. And you take the queen here, and it's a queen up for our knight. And white will go on to win this game easily. So black's big mistake was when they decided to recapture the center pawn. The correct move here, after white takes in the center, is to first kick their knight away. Make the white knight move. And once the white knight moves away, say here, now you can do this. Because if white tries this open file strategy, black also has the open file. And this is defended, and if white tries to kick it away, well, okay, I'll go back. And these queens look at each other, but it's no problem. It's defended, and white's knight has no tricks. So this is the correct way to play the Russian defense, by first kicking white's knight away. One more trap I want to show, and the last one I want to show, I would say happens all the time at a beginner level. So there's one way to defend this pawn that I have not mentioned yet, with this move pawn to f6. This move violates another rule that we teach, which is don't move your f-pawn. That rule is almost always good advice. If you know what you're doing and you have a strategy, or you're a high-level strength player, yeah, move your f-pawn, you know what you're doing. But when you're learning, when you're just starting out and you're just trying to learn, people advise not to move this pawn because you're creating a weakness here along the diagonal. And we're going to see how that comes into play now. So in this position, believe it or not, white can actually simply take this pawn. And you might think this gives away a knight for free. But after here, takes back, look at all this space around the black king. The king is weakened because you moved your f-pawn too early. And now, that diagonal I was mentioning, white has a way to pounce on it. With queen here, queen h5 check. Now, all of black's options are bad here, but let's look at the best one first. The point is, it's check, and I'm taking this too. So, if he blocks with the pawn, you take here, and no matter which move black plays here, you can take this rook in the corner. So this is a fork followed by a fork. First you fork here and here, and then you fork here and here. And that's one of the beautiful things about chess, is the geometry of these positions. Here, here, check. For example, queen blocks, take the rook. That's a rook up. Even if they take here with check, that's okay, because you can just move the king. Defending your pawn, everything's solid, and you're still attacking this knight, and you can play moves like bishop here, and white is fine here. That's black's best choice, and that's not saying much for black. The other choice is king up, and this is one of the classic traps that you see in these king's pawns openings. So now, white does his plan to take the pawn, check. One legal move, black has only one square to go to, f7. And you might think, yeah, black saved their rook. Good for you. You're going to develop your pieces, do things like this. But no, there's no time. So, bishop c4 check. Look at these squares. These squares are all covered. Black's king is getting a bit cut up here. If you play this move, pawn d5, to stop the check, then white can just take it, and the check is back on. This is similar to this knight move I mentioned earlier, where you throw the knight into the middle. It's just delaying the inevitable by one more move, and that's not going to help. So, they'll go here almost every time. It's the only other legal move, in fact. And now, I mean, white has a lot of ways to win, but you can come over here, check, protected by the pawn. And the black king has only one move. He has to go here to h6. And then you get to play this cool move, pawn d4. Check again. Did you see that? What you've done is you've unleashed this bishop into the attack with a deadly check. If the queen blocks the check, queen takes is checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. Every single square is covered, and this is protected by the bishop. Similarly, if he goes pawn here, which is the only other legal way to stop this check, then, well, if white tries to get a little greedy and take it, then black can take back. And then you take it, and then you take it, and black lives. Black is alive. The checks are over. The king is weird, but black will survive this. So, instead of taking right away, you can increase the pressure with this move, h4. What you're trying to do is play pawn takes here. Also getting the rook into the game like this. So, black cannot take this pawn because there's a pin here. And we've talked about pins before. If the pawn moves either forward or captures this way, that will release the bishop onto the king in a check, and you're not allowed to move into check. That's illegal. The computer will not let me do it. So, with this inevitable threat, the black king has almost no moves. Maybe black will defend this pawn, and we simply take here. And so the rook has come into the game. The pawn is checking the king. That's double check. King has one move here, and there's a checkmate in one. Do you think you see it? This weak f-file, the f7 square, it bites him again. Queen f7, protected by the bishop. The queen covers this, and you've got a pawn here, and that's game over. So, let's quickly look back at all the things that we just learned. Pawn up, knight f3, knight c6. This is the solid defense played at all levels of chess. Pawn d6, the Philidor, is a little bit old. It's an old line. It's a little bit out of date, but it does defend the pawn and it does the job. However, you got to watch out because you're blocking in your bishop. If the queen moves here to e7 or f6, white can just simply get their pieces out normally, and the queen will get attacked in the future. And that's not the right way for black. If you play the Russian defense with knight f6, takes, then if they take, you get this open file trap. Like we said, knight moves away somewhere, and knight here to c6, hitting the queen and hitting the only square the queen could block in. So that's a trap on the queen. The correct move, of course, attacking the knight, and then taking your pawn back. And this is a very complicated, yet pretty equal position. The other choice we mentioned is bishop here, but that blocks the center pawn. And it's not losing, black's not in any kind of trouble, but it's just slightly worse, and that's not the right way. The bishop wants to go here to c5 or here to e7 in the opening. This is a bit dubious, and it's blocked by its own pawns anyway. Finally, if pawn to f6, we have this cool trap where you simply take the pawn. After pawn takes, we have queen h5 check. Now, if g6 blocking, you take in the center, he'll block with something, maybe the knight, and then you take the rook. If king f7, then you have this check, and then that's very bad for black. And remember, if queen blocks, you take the rook anyway. Check here, and you just move. Nothing to be afraid of here. Black's pieces are not developed, which means the white king is very safe. And finally, if king e7, take in the center, one move, check, one move, check, one move. Remember this cool, you could also play pawn here. It's the same thing. Pawn d4 or d3. You just want to get this bishop into the game. Whoops, well, this way. So let's go d3 this time. it's the same thing. Excuse me. So he blocks, and now you increase the pressure. The king has to run for it now, or defend his pawn. So he'll defend it with the bishop, perhaps. Check, and mate. One other variation I forgot to mention is if he runs for it now. Well, you have this check anyway. You're always playing queen f7 check. He has to go back, and capturing either way is good, but pawn takes is double check and mate. So those are some of the most common moves you'll see after this knight to f3, and how to get a good advantage in all those positions as white. So I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next video.